Today we are revisiting the story of Abraham and Sodom, and in particular, what it tells us about the fate of Sodom. And of course, as you all undoubtedly recall, what it tells us is not pretty. So let's, at least initially, review the storyline as we read it in Genesis chapter 18, and then, of course, heading, we'll get to this a little bit later, into Genesis chapter 19. In Genesis chapter 18, after Abraham and Sarah have showered their generous hospitality upon the three strangers, these men rose up and looked out towards Sodom. Looking out, the Hebrew in particular, vayeshkifu, that has an ominous ring to it. And Abraham is going with them on their way. God says, "Shall I hide from Abraham that which I am doing?" And after presenting, indeed, Abraham's unequivocal righteousness that warrants God not hiding from Abraham what he is doing, God says in verse 20, "The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and verily, their sin is exceeding grievous." I will now go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. And verse 22, the men turned from thence and went toward Sodom, and Abraham stood yet before God. And what follows, of course, is the dialogue between Abraham and God over the fate of Sodom. Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Perchance there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you indeed sweep away and not forgive the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? That be far from you." Translation, God forbid, God forfend that you do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, that so the righteous should be as the wicked. God forfend, shall not the judge of all the earth do justly? And of course, what follows in the dialogue is God's assurance, if indeed I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, I will forgive all the place for their sake. And what then ensues is the bargaining, as it were, that Abraham asks about 45, and God gives him the assurance that he won't destroy it if there are 45 righteous people, and then 40, and then 30, and then 20, and then 10, and then it's over. And God went his way as soon as he had left off speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. And as of course emerges afterward in chapter 19, the events that then follow seal the fate of Sodom. But inevitably on some plane, the initial question of Abraham continues to reverberate in our ears and in our mind, and perhaps most of all, in our hearts. Of course, there's more than one dimension that is germane in considering Abraham's plea. We've discussed this previously in other contexts. I'm merely noting it here because, of course, it is directly germane for the purposes of our discussion here, that Abraham's challenge to God, a challenge to divine justice, clearly presumes that Abraham considers himself to have an innate sense of what is just, so that it isn't a matter of a simple equation, whatever God does defines justice, but rather a challenge. You, God, how can you do such a thing? To slay the righteous with the wicked. That is an affront to my sense of justice. So, of course, inevitably, that is the major thrust of Abraham's statement. But concomitantly, we wonder, we ask ourselves, what about compassion? Why is that element of compassion, it would seem, so absent from the story? In order to answer this question, I think we need to do some basic Sodomite history. Now, of course, when I use the word history, I feel obliged to stress, and this is a point that we've discussed in other contexts as well, that the Bible, even when it reports historical events, is not a history book. The Bible reports whatever it reports in order to teach us, to instruct us. The Torah means teaching. It's there to teach us. And inevitably then, when we consider the record of Sodomite history, this is precisely the question we need to ask the Bible and ourselves. What are we supposed to learn from this story? So, returning to the first instance in which we encounter Sodom and its conduct in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 13, you may recall, Abraham has a problem with Lot. More specifically, there's a problem of Abraham's shepherds and Lot's shepherds. They're arguing, there's strife between them. So he says to Lot, let there be no strife between me and you, and between your shepherds, your herdsmen, and mine. The whole land is before us. Let's separate. We'll go our different directions. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, I'll go to the left. You choose. And in chapter 13, verse 10, we read, and Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. Before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of God, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. Of course, in the context of the narrative, the question of the fertility and prosperity of the land is relevant because that's what Lot notices, and that's his choice. So Lot chose all the plain of the Jordan and journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. And then the Bible inserts a kind of ominous postscript. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners against God exceedingly. Obviously, in the context of the narrative, this is telling us something very important about Lot. Namely, he didn't care. He chose to live in Sodom despite the iniquity of the inhabitants, because of the fertility, because of the prosperity. Obviously, this has manifest ramifications to all of us in choosing where we are going to live. That is, Lot is a role model, not a positive role model. When one puts economic considerations ahead of moral and ethical considerations, That's a problem, to say the least. In any case, it is here in this verse, chapter 13, verse 13, that the Torah first introduces us to the moral depravity of the people of Sodom. Although, truth be told, here it is a rather oblique and vague statement. We're only told the people were wicked and sinners against God. We aren't told what they did. We do, of course, get far more specific elaboration in a particular instance in Genesis chapter 19. The two angels came to Sodom that evening, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. Now, as a matter of course, as we note in manifold passages in the Bible, the one who sat in the gate was the judge. And Lot presumably is sitting in the gate in a leadership role. And he sees the angels and greets them as strangers. Behold now, my lords, turn aside, I pray you, into your servant's house, tarry all night, wash your feet, rise up early, be on your way. Initially, the angels demur, and in verse 3 we see he urged them greatly. So they turned into him, and they came into his house, and he makes for them a meal. And then the people of Sodom show their colors. Before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. And they called to Lot and said to him, where are the men that came into you this night? Bring them out to us that we may know them. And, of course, knowing them in the biblical idiom has a very clear and very ominous connotation. And Lot went out to them and shut the door after him. And he said, I pray you, my brethren, do not so wickedly. And he very diplomatically tells them off. In verse 8, he makes an offer that makes us shudder. But be that as it may, he besieges them, to these men do nothing for as much as they are come under the shadow of my roof. And their reaction, stand back. This one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs play the judge. Now he's judging us. He's telling us, do not so wickedly. Ooh, we will deal worse with you than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and drew near to break the door. So, of course, in reading this narrative in chapter 19, we see the people of Sodom. We see their wickedness. We see their sinfulness. And yet, tantalizingly, the sinfulness and iniquity of the people of Sodom is a theme that recurs on a number of additional occasions in the Bible. And from the recurrences, it appears it wasn't simply the sort of despicable, abominable behavior that appears to emerge from the text in Genesis chapter 19. We know, of course, very well, at least in English, that the word sodomy is based upon the conduct of the Sodomites, or at least their aspirations, in Genesis chapter 19. But now consider what we read in Jeremiah chapter 23. Jeremiah in chapter 23 speaks of the sins of his co-religionists in the kingdom of Samaria, northern Israel, and in the kingdom of Judah, in Jerusalem. And what emerges in verses 13 and 14 appears to be a kind of comparison. And I have seen unseemliness in the prophets of Samaria. They prophesied by Baal and caused my people Israel to err. Now we know what prophesying by Baal means. That's idolatry, plain and simple. Certainly an abomination by any standard. And we move on to verse 14. And that's not the crime with which he accuses the false prophets in Judah, in Jerusalem. In the prophets of Jerusalem, I have seen a horrible thing. This, in context, appears to be something even more horrible than the idolatry of the false prophets in Samaria. They commit adultery and walk in lies, which might seem bad enough at face value, but he continues. And they strengthen the hands of evildoers, that none returns from his wickedness, no one repents. They are all of them become unto me as Sodom, and the inhabitants thereof as Gomorrah. Now let's consider what's going on over here. If indeed it was a matter simply, facilely, of adultery, then strengthening the hand of evildoers is nothing by comparison. But perhaps in context, this is the adultery. Because if you strengthen the hands of evildoers, who are, for example, committing adultery themselves, then in the prophet's assessment, that's tantamount to the commission of adultery yourself. That reinforcement of such bankrupt behavior is precisely what is unpardonable. And it is in the wake of that evaluation in verse 15 that from the prophets of Jerusalem is ungodliness gone forth into all the land. The ultimate ungodliness, we might have thought, would be idolatry. But what emerges from the words of Jeremiah here is the ultimate ungodliness is when you reinforce evil in the hands of people who might otherwise have repented and now won't because of that reinforcement. Again, in verse 17, they say continually unto them that despise me. God has said, you'll have peace, nothing to worry about. And to everyone who walks in the stubbornness of his own heart, they say, no evil shall come upon you. Business as usual, everything is fine. That's the crime. And again, we reiterate, that is the crime that warrants the simile. They are all of them become unto me as Sodom, and the inhabitants thereof as Gomorrah. That is, behaving in a manner that inures oneself and others to the continued, ongoing commission of evil. Because I'm fine, I don't need to do anything differently, I don't need to change. It is undoubtedly in a similar vein that we understand another indictment, here directly relating to the people of Sodom. In Ezekiel chapter 16, behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and careless ease was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it. Let's consider what this is telling us. And in particular, how this bears upon Genesis chapter 19. According to what Ezekiel is telling us here, the core crime of which the people of Sodom were guilty was in their pride and fullness of bread and careless ease, they didn't strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. So, of course, getting back to Genesis chapter 19, most glaringly, what we encounter is brazen, despicable sexual immorality. But in the prophet's assessment, ironically, that was merely means to an end. They may not have even related to sexual immorality as the abomination we consider it. Maybe given social conditioning, they thought it would be okay. The agenda in justifying this plan to rape the strangers was, we don't want strangers here. We don't want wayfarers. We don't want indigents. We will do everything that we need to do in order to get rid of them. Because we have our prosperity. We have our wealth. And we don't want to squander our resources by strengthening the hand of the poor and needy. Now, of course, inevitably, in considering the implications of what we see in Ezekiel, we can't help but go back to what we saw in Genesis chapter 13. Remember the evaluation? That Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. It was fertile. It was flourishing. It was prosperous. Turns out that wasn't merely an ancillary observation independent of the moral assessment of the people of Sodom as wicked and sinners. It had a lot to do with their wickedness and sinfulness, because what it amounted to was the basis, on the one hand, of the divine summons to use their wealth productively in doing acts of kindness, generosity for those in need. And on the other hand, because they didn't, because having been given this opportunity, we've noted this many times, opportunities that are granted by God always impose responsibility. They shirk their responsibility. For them, then, the prosperity was a challenge they failed. And therefore, it was an indictment. We're familiar with this sort of phenomenon in other contexts as well. That is, we might well consider here the observation in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 12. There is a grievous evil which I have seen under the sun, namely, riches kept by the owner thereof to his hurt. Now, the owner may not know that those riches are only harming him. But when you have that opportunity and you shirk the responsibility, wealth becomes an indictment. And that's what happens here. They had the wealth, they had the prosperity, they had the opportunity. And under such circumstances, note, it's not just sins of commission that are actively prosecuted, that are punishable. It's also sins of omission. You could have done something productive, and you just sat there passively and didn't do anything. Once we consider that message, I think we're already ripe for a very important conclusion with respect to compassion and its limits. Compassion was exactly what Sodom lacked. They didn't show compassion. And it is in this vein that I think it's instructive for us to consider yet another instance in which we encounter the indictment of Sodom. In Isaiah chapter 3, the prophet speaks of the ruin of Jerusalem and of Judah, and invoking the simile of Sodom. In Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9, the show of their countenance witnesses against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have wrought evil unto themselves. That tells us a lot. What goes around, the old saying goes, comes around. If Sodom has no compassion, then inevitably there's no compassion to go around for Sodom when the time comes. And indeed, Isaiah follows this with two verses that stress it's not really a matter of punishment. It's not even a matter of you get what you deserve. It's much more basic than that. You are what you have become. So in verse 10, say you of the righteous, that it shall be well with him, for they shall eat of the fruit of their doings. This is what they made themselves into. And the consequences, may they be blessed, are wonderful. But concomitantly, in verse 11, woe unto the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the work of his hands shall be done to him. Whatever he thought he was doing is boomeranging against him. In other words, again, the absence of compassion with respect to Sodom is precisely the absence of compassion for which they themselves are responsible. This principle, the realization that indeed what you get is what you have become, is one that we find repeatedly in Scripture. I'm not going to belabor this point because it's practically ubiquitous, but I think it is instructive for us to consider it in a number of contexts. In David's song, that appears both in Samuel 2, chapter 22, and in Psalm 18, in almost the same language. Therefore has God recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his eyes. In other words, I am what I've become. And in elaborating on this theme in verse 26, with the merciful, you show yourself merciful. Since they are merciful, that's the way they experience God's hand in their lives. They experience divine mercy. And indeed, with the upright man, you show yourself upright. They experience divine uprightness. Similarly, verse 27, with the pure, you show yourself pure. But of course, inevitably, the flip side of this, and with the crooked or perverse, you show yourself crooked. Again, not merely you get what you deserve, you are what you have become. And as much as this is what they became, the consequences are inescapable. And indeed, in a similar vein, we might note a couple of illuminating examples from Proverbs. In Proverbs 3, if it concerns the scorners, he scorned them. That is, again, they'll experience God as a scorner. Unto the humble, he gives grace. The wise will inherit honor, because that's what they are. As to the fools, they carry away shame, because that's what they are. And similarly, in Proverbs chapter 13, righteousness guards him who is upright in the way. In other words, the protection, as it were, bestowed upon the righteous is the protection of the righteous's own righteousness. And conversely, wickedness overthrows the sinner. Evil pursues sinners. What evil? Well, of course, the evil that they perpetrated, but it continues to pursue them. To the righteous, good shall be repaid. And in a sense, as a continuation of this theme, skipping to verse 24, a well-known verse in Proverbs, he who spares his rod hates his son, that he who loves him chastens him, disciplines him early. I'm emphasizing this verse in particular, both because of the obvious association, that is, again, you are what you have become, and in particular with the heightened sensitivity that we should have from the foregoing overview of what Sodom was like. That when you take it easy, resting easy is the ultimate indictment. The folks in Sodom had everything. And because they had everything, because they felt that that bounty excused their withdrawing from any kind of responsibility to society, that more than anything else was their undoing. Now, of course, inevitably we recognize challenges apply to each and every one of us. God gives each of us a different set of material wealth, spiritual wealth, resources, because he puts each and every one of us into this world with a purpose. And we are exquisitely, precisely calibrated in the gifts that God gives us to face our challenges and to discharge our responsibilities and to accomplish our mission in the world. Everyone gets a different set of gifts. We might think that the challenge of the Sodomites in having such tremendous material bounty is a nice challenge to have. But obviously things are not necessarily so easy. Because we recognize again that whatever you are determines what you get. You are what you make yourself into. And indeed, in this vein, we should note further the words of Jeremiah. I, God, search the heart and try the reins, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings. And we reiterate, to folks in Sodom, their ways in practice were no compassion. Those are the ways that God as well. It's not because God, as it were, specifically withholds from them his bounty. Rather, on the contrary, he gave them the gifts. But what becomes of those gifts ultimately is up to us. As expressed in Isaiah, in chapter 30, verse 18, therefore will God wait that he may be gracious to you, and therefore will he be exalted, that he may have compassion upon you. God wants to shower us with his grace and his compassion. And he's waiting. He's waiting for us to make ourselves recipients. But he's waiting. Because ultimately, this is something that he has placed in our hands. And it's our responsibility. Indeed, we should note in this vein that in Job, this realization is in itself the rebuttal of those who think that God does purposefully commit wickedness or iniquity. Rather, as expressed in chapter 34, verse 11, for the work of a man will he requite unto him, and cause every man to find according to his ways. And again, same idea that we've seen all along. You are what you have become. Yea, of a surety God will not do wickedly, neither will the Almighty pervert justice. But if one has no compassion, one certainly will receive no compassion either. I'll conclude this observation with one additional verse from Psalm 121. And I can see at the outset that my comment here is a little bit homiletical. God is your keeper. God is your shadow upon your right hand. You know, one thing is perfectly self-evident about your shadow. It does exactly what you do. It, to use the verb, shadows you. Whatever move you make, it makes. And Psalm 121, in likening God to your shadow, assures you God's going to do the same thing. He will manifest himself to you in the same measure, in the same behavior, as it were, that you are manifest to him. So it's up to us. And of course, again, then, as a kind of conclusion, going back to the folks in Sodom, they too are role models. Remember, even when the Bible speaks about history, it never does so as a history book. It's not coming to teach us history. It's coming to teach us how to live. When one gazes upon the gifts that God grants and does not gaze upon them as an opportunity and therefore a responsibility, when instead one just sits back passively and does nothing, the consequences indeed are going to be ruinous. Of course, when all is said and done, in the case of the folks in Sodom, we get the message, but surely there is little reason to dwell upon this model of such perversely wicked people, because it's obvious to us that's not what we should be doing. It's obvious to us that in conducting our affairs in a manner that so brazenly flouts justice and decency, we're digging our own pit. Well, it should be obvious to us. Frankly, looking around in Western society today, it doesn't seem to me that it is anywhere near as obvious as it should be. Neither in the realm of individuals, nor in the realm of governments, nor in the realm of societies generally. But maybe that's because they're not reading the Bible on us. There's an additional dimension, however, that pertains to Sodom that also has a lot to do with compassion, and has a lot to do with whether one is going to passively sit by and just accept, or be proactive and do. And while considering the role model of the folks in Sodom may strike us as an obvious lesson to be learned, there's a much more subtle message that I feel obliged to append to it when we consider what the Bible tells us more broadly about the fate of Sodom, and indeed the fate of others in the calamitous ends that came upon them. Specifically, at this juncture, I'd like to put aside the issue of material bounty, gifts of physical prosperity, such as those that God bestowed upon Sodom, and consider rather how we relate to spiritual bounty, to spiritual gifts that God bestows upon us, of course with the realization that they certainly, we could even say even more so than the material bounty and physical gifts represent an opportunity granted by God, and thus a responsibility for us to harness them appropriately. And in that vein, I'd like to compare 4 individuals: Noah, Abraham, Lot, and Moses, and how they conducted themselves in what we could broadly describe as similar situations. So the first case, of course, is the case of Noah. Noah is told of the impending doom of all of humanity. All of humanity except for him and his wife and his sons and their wives. And what does Noah do about it? This is a striking message that emerges in Isaiah chapter 54. You know, there are some people who relish the opportunity to have their name etched in big letters on a plaque that memorializes them. Well, in Isaiah chapter 54, verse 9, we read about the plaque that is Noah's epitaph, the waters of Noah. The flood that destroyed humanity in this verse is twice described as the waters of Noah. Not exactly the kind of plaque that most of us would like to have as memorials. Why is the flood called the waters of Noah? But of course, we know the answer. I kind of already intimated it. What did Noah do to prevent the flood when God told him about it? There was a divine warning. There was the divine summons to build the ark. What about preaching, conveying a message, getting the word out, something? He's building a big boat, according to the implication of the scripture. He's building this boat for 120 years. It's not apart from that. God's told him the fate of humanity is in the balance. Noah, what are you going to do about it? And Noah does nothing. Okay, God, you're the boss. You want to destroy humanity? I'm passive. I have my little niche of spirituality, my communion with God. As for the rest of humanity, to Noah doesn't make a difference. That's my first case. And indeed, in this regard, Noah failed, and he has the flood called by his name to his everlasting shame. And the next example is Abraham. So what happens with Abraham? We already saw what happens with Abraham. In the case of Abraham, very clearly, very stridently, Abraham, immediately upon learning of the impending doom of humanity, when God tells him about the indictment of the folks in Sodom, Abraham's reaction is, as we saw, are you going to sweep them all away? What about divine justice? Be far from you. Abraham has very strident words of appeal to God. And of course, we know what follows. That Abraham then strives to avert the divine decree, appealing to God to save the cities because of 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. So certainly, comparing with Noah, Abraham is very proactive here. Abraham sees his responsibility as doing his utmost to intercede, even on behalf of the wicked folks in Sodom. But when a minimum of 10 cannot be found, God goes his way, and Abraham returned to his place. And in this instance, Abraham doesn't succeed. And Sodom is destroyed. Having stated that, there is a tantalizing comparison that we need to draw between Abraham's lack of success and the unlikely success of Lot. That is, on the one hand, Lot himself certainly doesn't strike us as a particularly worthy individual, to the extent that in Genesis chapter 19, verse 29, we read of the salvation of Lot as simply something that was by Abraham's merit. That when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. So it was all, again, for the sake of Abraham that Lot was saved, which ought to certainly imply that if Abraham is unable to save anyone in Sodom, then Lot certainly shouldn't. How ironic, then, that we read in chapter 19, in the description of Lot's escape from Sodom with his family members, the angels take Lot and the rest of the family out of the city, and they say, escape for your life, don't look back, don't stay in all the plain, escape to the mountain, lest you be swept away. Whereupon Lot explains, oh, please don't do this, God. Verse 19, behold, now your servant has found grace in your sight, and you have magnified your mercy, which you have shown me in saving my life. And I cannot escape to the mountain, lest the evil overtake me and I die. That is, I'm an old man. I'm no mountain climber. I can't get to the mountain. So Lot comes up with a compromise proposal. He says, behold, now this city is near to flee unto, and it is a little one. Oh, let me escape thither. Is it not a little one, and my soul shall live? The city of Zoar. The city of Zoar, one of the 5 cities that initially was subject to the divine decree of destruction. Now remember, Abraham couldn't save any of the cities, including Zoar. Lot says, oh, please don't make me climb mountains. Can we save the city? And immediately, on the spot, he said to him, see, I have accepted you concerning this thing, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Hasten there, for I cannot do anything till you come there. Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar, and Zoar is saved. Why is Zoar saved? What merit has Lot, who himself was only saved by the merit of Abraham, to save all the city? And I think it's critical for us to face up to the answer here. Abraham's beseeching God's compassion with respect to the inhabitants of Sodom and all the other cities was truly, sincerely sticking his neck out on their behalf. But, at the end of the day, Abraham has a home to which to return. And indeed, that's precisely what happens at the end of the story. As we saw, at the end of all the bargaining in order to save the people of Sodom. And God went his way as soon as he had left off speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. That's a luxury that Abraham has that Lot doesn't. Lot doesn't have any other place. He doesn't have any place to go back to. That is, in this vein, recalling again that the essential problem of Sodom as well was the lackadaisical attitude of, we have everything and we don't need to do anything. So long as you can still hold on to some sense of stability and calm. I'll strive, I'll even struggle, but only to a point. That point, of course, for the Sodomites was 0. But Abraham, too, strives and then relents. So far as Lot is concerned, giving up isn't an option. Lot, in effect, says to God, God, you've done me this tremendous act of grace in saving my life. Well, the only way my life is going to be saved now, since I can't get up to the mountain, is if you save not only me, but also this whole city. And so God says, okay, I'll save the city. If you have so utterly conjoined your fate to the fate of that city, that even if that city is totally unworthy of salvation, and even if you're not all that worthy yourself, but you have been deemed worthy of being saved, then by your conjoining your fate to the fate of the city, you save the city. Because you're not sitting back passively, enjoying the gifts that God has given you, spiritual or material. You are rather seeing them as a summons, as a responsibility, something you need to do. That, of course, is with respect to Lot. And the measure of success that Lot has, that in a way, exceeds that of Abraham. But I mentioned a fourth role model of consideration who brings this message to its ultimate fruition, and that's Moses. God tells Moses that the people have sinned. This is in Exodus chapter 32, the sin of the golden calf. And Moses appeals to God's compassion. In verse 31, he returned to God and said, oh, this people have sinned a great sin and have made them a god of gold. But now look at verse 32. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, fine. And if not, blot me, I pray, out of the book that you have written. What is he saying? No, in fact, what he's saying is, you have deemed this people worthy of extirpation. And by consequence, you said you're going to destroy them and make me into a great nation. Well, I'm not going to let you. I am so utterly conjoining my fate to the fate of this people. If you don't forgive them, if you destroy them, I'm first. Blot me out of the book that you have written. Further amplifying this theme, in Exodus chapter 33, in verse 12, Moses says to God, see, you say to me, bring up this people. You haven't let me know who you will send with me. Even though you said, I know you by name, and you have found grace in my sight. And therefore, I pray you, if indeed I have found grace in your sight, show me your ways, that I may know you, to the end that I might find grace in your sight, and consider this nation is your people. And God says, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And Moses says to God, well, your presence better be going with us. If your presence does not go with me, don't bring us up to the land. Forget it. The whole mission is finished. For wherein now shall it be known that I have found grace in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in that you go with us? So you've got to go with us. Sin, no sin, you don't have a choice. I am so utterly conjoining myself to the fate of this people. Whatever you do to them, you have to do to me. And Moses saves all of Israel with this argument. If at one end of this scale is the wickedness and depravity of Sodom, in saying, we have everything, and we don't need to do anything. The opposite end of the spectrum is Moses saying, I don't care what I have. I am conjoining myself to the fate of my people. And if you don't give them everything, I don't want anything. And that's what God had in fact summoned of Moses. It wasn't really that the verdict had been issued. It was that God was giving Moses this challenge. This challenge to stand in the breach. This challenge to recognize, really, you should never be passive. You should never sit back and accept and be the recipient as opposed to the doer, the active one, the one committed to make the change. Because God didn't put us in this world in order to just sit back and relax. That's what the Sodomites did. And you see what happened to them. They weren't allowed to stay in this world. Because that's not what this world is for. Rather, God put us in this world with a charge, with a mandate, with a responsibility to do our utmost to make this world more godly. Recall again the similes to Sodom in the words of the prophets. Those were indictments over not doing anything to make the change. The indictments over things are good enough the way they are. The indictment over we don't really need to do anything terribly active right now, do we? That was the indictment. And we are summoned to respond to that challenge by saying, yes, we are. We get the message loud and clear. God has taken us on, as it were, as his junior partners, given us a summons to fix up the world. And that then is the challenge with which this whole enterprise concludes. We started out the fate of Sodom, compassion and its limits, because you get what you are. You are what you have become. What we appreciate more than anything else is what God wants us to become is his junior partners, never satisfied with what is, always sensing the obligation to do more to make this world a more godly place. God bless you.